God does, and there are so many things that He does, and sometimes we simply fail to realize how good He is, and sometimes when we do realize it, we simply forget to say thanks. So I want to actually start off, let me give you a couple of really important announcements. First of all, you know that we have the egg hunt coming up this Saturday. It's a very exciting time. You can tell who's in charge of it. It must be Eric, because he's cheering for it. But there will likely be close to 1,000, maybe even more people here on the church property on Saturday. It'll be a great opportunity for us as a church to be a light to this community. There was a time that the community provided an Easter egg hunt, but basically they decided that they were competing with us and they didn't want to do it. They actually gave us some of their stuff, which is great. Next week, we will provide the community Easter egg hunt for the Upper Chichester area. As we do so, there are many of you who have already stepped up, and I want to say thank you for what you've done. There are thousands of eggs that are already sitting over in the other building. That being said, if you want to grab more, there are still some empty eggs out there today that you can still have filled and back to us before, if you would, before Thursday. That'll give us time to make sure that everything is divided up evenly among the kids. But it is going to be a great time. If you have not volunteered already, if you haven't talked to Pastor Eric to tell him that you want to be there, that you want to help out, you need to do so today. It takes a lot to be able to manage 1,000+ people on a church property. So I really encourage you to be a part of that. If you can't physically be there, and if you can't help with the eggs, don't think we're going to look down on you. Instead, what I'm going to ask you to do, I need you to be praying that God would do such a mighty work that there's no way anybody could receive credit for it except for God Himself. So I ask each of you to be a part of that. This Thursday, we'll celebrate Maundy Thursday. We do a communion service. This year we're doing a little bit different. It's going to be a 2-hour service. However, you don't have to stay for the full 2 hours. You come whenever you're ready in that window, and you simply take the time. There'll be some quiet music that'll be playing on the sound system, and you take the time, you pray as long as you need, and then you come up and you partake in the elements of the Lord's table, and then you're free to go whenever you want as well. It's just an opportunity to make it a little more personal instead of more driven by Pastor Mike. It'll be actually driven by the Spirit and by you again. So I want to encourage you with that. Now let me share with you a praise, because sometimes we fail to say thanks when God does something. A little over a month ago, I shared with you about a friend of mine who had made a foolish choice, and the result of his foolish choice was he ended up being shot a total of 8 times. He was in intensive care at the time in Crozier Hospital, and at that point they did not expect him to make it. Yesterday, he and I got to talk in front of his house. As soon as he saw me, he said, "Hey, Mike." So I went over and I told him, I said, "You don't know how happy I am to see you here." And he said, "Thank you for praying." He couldn't get up. He still can't walk. Actually, his wife had to get him to the position where he was, and she is there with him still. And he said, "Thank you for praying." I said, "Well, it really wasn't just me." I said, "I know of a church that prayed for you." He said, "I know." He said, "I never wanted anybody praying for me, but I could tell people were praying." When we were done, and by the way, when I first met him, it was 6 years ago. One of the first things I did was tell him I was a pastor, and he said, "Oh, well, maybe my wife will be interested in what you have to offer." In other words, I'm not, but maybe she is. When I got ready to leave, he said, "Maybe you could come over and we could have a prayer meeting." And all I could think is, what an incredible miracle of God, that He would take someone who, first of all, physically was about to die. Consider the man was shot 8 times. You expect him to die. I'm sure that the individual who shot him expected him to die. But even beyond that, he's moved from being spiritually dead to now actually being alive and hungering for Christ and wanting His move of the Spirit in his life. So often we forget to say thanks to God, but what an incredible testimony to God's miraculous power. Today we're continuing the story of Lazarus, and of course as we look at Lazarus, it's only a brief excerpt about him in John chapter 11, but if you'll notice, repeatedly afterwards it references Lazarus. because Lazarus sort of lays the groundwork for what was going to take place. You remember, then Jesus ends up at the house of Simon the leper. That's what we looked at last week, where he's actually sitting with Lazarus, with Simon, who was formerly the leper, and they're literally, they're just celebrating what God has done. And it said at the end of our passage last week that many who were coming to see Lazarus, to see this miracle that had taken place, were beginning to believe in Jesus. Well, almost word for word, you're going to see the exact same phrase in what we read today. I'm going to ask if you would to turn in your Bibles to John chapter 12, and we're going to look at verses 12 through 21 today. As we look at this passage, I really want you to see that this is more than just one moment in time that took place, but this is something that has been being led up to for weeks already, and now we just see it all coming together at this moment. It says, beginning in John 12, verse 12, "The next day the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, 'Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel.' Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written, 'Do not be afraid, daughter Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt.' At first his disciples didn't understand all this. Only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him, and that these things had been done to him. Now the crowd that was with him, when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead, continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had performed this sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, 'See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him.' Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the festival. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. 'Sir,' they said, 'we would like to see Jesus.'" I added those last two verses to the passage. The way the Bible is divided up, often there are sections. And actually, we could have stopped at verse 19, but I really believe that verse 21 is incredibly important to us. There were individuals who were there who weren't even Jewish by birth, but they wanted to see Jesus. Believe it or not, but we are surrounded by a world full of people that truly want to see Jesus. They want to see something that is different. They want to see something that is real. And Jesus Christ is the only thing that can satisfy the true needs that are present within them. Now, there was an Episcopal priest who was preaching in an unfamiliar church one Sunday morning. As he stood in the pulpit to begin the service, he tapped the microphone to make sure that it was on. He heard nothing, even though it was working just fine. So he leaned closer to the microphone and said, or he thought to himself, "There is something wrong with this thing." The congregation, being well-trained church people, immediately responded, "And also with you." In the Presbyterian church, it's not uncommon for the priest to start the service with "Peace be with you," and "also with you." And that's how people respond. They apparently thought that's what he said. It can become very dangerous for us to be able to do things without paying attention to what we're doing. It can be dangerous to drive on a road that we drive on every single day. It can be dangerous because we stop being alert. We start taking things for granted. We figure we can drive this route with our eyes closed, and unfortunately, I think sometimes people do drive those routes with their eyes closed. If something different happens on the road, we may not even notice it at all, at least until it's too late. A husband and wife can soon take for granted all the things their spouse does. In fact, they become so used to the provisions, the meals, meals being cooked, the garbage being taken out, the laundry being done, the yard being mowed, all of the other stuff, that before long we don't even realize the person is doing those things. Before we know it, we feel like we're the only one putting anything into our relationship. It is at those points that marital affairs often occur. A parent can become so used to having their children fill their lives with joy that they don't appreciate their child until they begin to move away. And this is also the danger that we face as we come to Easter. The accounts of the triumphal entry, the cross, and Easter are so familiar to us that we can easily go through the motions of a celebration without ever allowing the message or the events to touch us. The challenge every year is to read these accounts with fresh eyes. I ask you to look with me this morning at the account of the triumphal entry, maybe from a little bit different perspective. First of all, we see there is a strong declaration of love. This event was so out of character for Jesus. It wasn't what you typically would have expected. Previous to this, Jesus had always avoided the spotlight. In John chapter 2, Jesus is asked by his mother if he would help out at a wedding feast where there was a wine shortage. Jesus responded, "My time has not yet come." He knew there would come a time that he would be exalted and everyone would look to him, but it had not yet come. So he basically said, actually, this is the nice way of putting it, don't bother me. I don't want everybody to know right now what I'm going to do. Jesus didn't want to make a public scene. In John 6, we see an occasion when Jesus felt that the people were ready to take him by force and make him their king. Rather than enjoy the public acclaim which he deserved, Jesus left town. In fact, whenever the ministry of Jesus seemed to be getting to a point of success in a community, Jesus would move to another community. It was as if he didn't want to have to be surrounded by that attention. On several occasions, Jesus tells those who he has healed, "Don't tell anyone." Jesus was not looking for public demonstration on his behalf. He was not seeking the spotlight until this day. On this day, he knew that his time had come. It was organized also by Jesus himself. This was not some random event that took place. Again, in the Gospel of Luke, we're told that Jesus had arranged to use a donkey. He told his disciples to go to town to find this donkey that would be tied outside. And if they're asked what they're doing, tell them that the master needs this donkey. Jesus orchestrated the whole event. Jesus sent them, he told them where to go, and then he had them come back and bring this donkey to him. It wasn't a spontaneous demonstration. Jesus intended all of this to happen. The question that I ask is why? Why did Jesus want all of these things to take place, and why now? Why did he orchestrate this event? It certainly wasn't because Jesus wanted to throw a party in his own honor. When Jesus caught his first glimpse of Jerusalem, he didn't stop to savor the moment. He didn't get all excited and kind of have a big pep rally with his disciples. You know what he did? He wept. He looked over the city and he began to weep because he knew what was about to take place, and he knew that the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords was coming to town, but the people were about to reject him. They were going to turn him away. They were literally going to kill him. This procession was not frivolous. Instead, it was very purposeful. It was not provoked by vanity, but by compassion and love. Why? First, it was time. It was time for Jesus to do what he came to do. In verse 23, we read, "The hour has come." God was determined the timing. God has already determined now is the time that my son is to be delivered. These leaders had previously decided that it was unwise to make a move against Jesus during the Passover. They felt it would cause too much of an uproar, so they were willing to wait until things cooled down a little bit. All of that changes after this parade takes place on what we call Palm Sunday. Why was it important to Jesus that these men arrest him during Passover? Not only because there were all these people in town, and there were thousands and thousands, some people would suggest even at least 2 million people that likely were in town that day. It wasn't just because so many people were there. It was because it was God's plan for Jesus to die at the same time as all of the other sacrificial lambs. To understand the significance of this, you have to understand something about the Passover celebration. The purpose of Passover was to celebrate an event that had taken place decades, centuries earlier, when God delivered the people of Israel from the land of Egypt. They had been slaves there for many, many years. In fact, most estimated to be at least 400 years. While they were slaves there in Egypt, they cried out to the Lord, and He heard their cry. So He sent Moses as their deliverer. Moses comes and he brings various plagues to the region, and each one sort of makes the people of Egypt want them gone a little bit more, but the last one is the one that really breaks the straw, breaks the camel's back. It's the straw that breaks the camel's back. So I'm not real good with all those cliches and stuff. The last one is this. There's a Passover angel that will pass through the land of Egypt. And anyone who does not have the blood of a lamb sprinkled on their door, then they will lose their firstborn son. Every one of the Jewish people had blood sprinkled on their door, and not a single one of them lost a child that night. But among those of the Egyptian culture, all of them lost a firstborn son. It was the Passover of that angel that allowed them the opportunity then to be able to lead the Egyptian people. And Pharaoh said to Moses, "Take your people and go." They actually, when they leave, they literally plunder the Egyptian people. They were celebrating the sacrificial lambs that were given that helped make them free. It is likely at the very same time that Jesus was dying on the cross, the lambs were being slaughtered for the Passover feast to celebrate again. But this was the Lamb who would take away He would not only set them free from a land, but He would set them free for all eternity. He would take away the sin of the world. Second, Jesus wanted to be clear that this was a voluntary act. He could have laid low. He could have simply decided not to be noticed. But Jesus refused. Even when the Pharisees and the religious leaders object to some of the cheering that the crowds are making, Jesus tells them, "Are you kidding? If these people were silent, the rocks would have to cry out." Jesus actually reveled in this moment. We read throughout the New Testament of times when the people went to kill Him and He simply walked away. They had no power over Him. They couldn't take Him until He allowed them to. Knowing what was before Him, betrayal, humiliation, suffering, and death, He chose to come to Jerusalem on this occasion. That's the extravagant love that I talked about last week. But it's God's extravagant love toward us. Jesus was not the unwilling victim of a vicious plot. He was a willing sacrifice for all who would believe. Do you realize how practical this message is? Some of you wonder if God could possibly love you. Perhaps you failed Him. You're so ashamed that it's impossible for you to imagine that God could still care about you. But look with fresh eyes at this parade in Jerusalem. Jesus is not surprised by our failures, our sins. He came to Jerusalem in order to deliver us from such things. He knows what you've done. He knows the worst things that have taken place in your life, but He wants to make you clean and to set you free. His invitation is simple. He says, "Come to me, all you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I ask, have you done that? Are you hiding from the very one who wants to love you more than life itself? Maybe it's time to stop hiding. It's time to start believing. Maybe life is difficult for you right now. Maybe you wonder if God is out to get you. Perhaps things are painful in your life. So painful that you are questioning His love for you. If that is the case, once again, I call your attention back to this parade in Jerusalem. You see, Jesus didn't have to go. But as He went, He had you on His mind. He knew the many ways that we would fail. He knew the many times that we would turn our backs on Him. But Jesus willingly went anyways, simply because He loved us. The trials that come at present may be uncomfortable to say this, but they are purposeful and they are designed to lead you into something good. What I mean by that is God can take even your worst problems and can turn into something really awesome if we would only allow Him to do so. Now, this leads me to my next point. Not only is God still in control and able to use even the tragedies of our life to transform us, but God also prepares us for change. In fact, everything changes at some point or another. Consider our story today. Jesus approaches Jerusalem and the crowd is in a frenzy. They're celebrating His arrival. Some probably were just kind of sucked into the excitement. They really weren't there to celebrate Jesus, but everybody else was, so they just kind of went along with everyone else. But there were some who came and they were there to worship the King of the Passover. Others were still amazed at what Jesus had done in recent days with Lazarus. In fact, near the end of our passage, I referenced it at the beginning, a lot of people were simply following Jesus because they had heard of what Jesus had done with Lazarus. What a great day this must have been for His disciples. They had left everything they owned simply to follow Jesus. It's likely that many of them were mocked over their choice to give up steady jobs or family businesses. Some parents were likely disappointed in their choices, but now it was finally paying off. People were appreciating us. They were loving us. For 3 years, they followed Jesus around, although they got to see some really amazing things and hear some great stories and teaching. They had little to show for it. Not only were they homeless, they were hated and threatened on a regular basis. Consider the words of Jesus' disciples when Jesus told them that they were heading back to Bethany where Lazarus had died. In John 11:8 it says, "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back." As if, what are you thinking, Jesus? And then after Jesus pretty much tells them, "We're going anyways," it's Thomas who says in John 11:16, "Let us also go, that we may die with Him." If you've ever had a job where you felt unappreciated, it was nothing like what they had. Not only was it uncomfortable, but they are being threatened with the possibility of losing their life. But not here. All of a sudden, it looks like everything is paying off. This is what we've been waiting for. They had to be so excited. On this day, Jesus would be celebrated. Certainly there would be times that Jesus would be greeted at the outskirts of other towns by crowds who were seeking miracles and grace. But today was so much more. Today was the day that they worshiped Him for who He truly was. They shouted, "Hosanna, Hosanna to the King." But in just a few short days, all of that would change again. Certainly, He would still be the King who deserved worship and praise. He would still be filled with love and compassion for the people of Jerusalem. He would not change. And likewise, many of the people would not change. I imagine that Simon, the one who was formerly a leper, no matter what happened, he was always going to be loyal to Jesus because he knew what Jesus had done for him. I imagine Lazarus, no matter what took place, his loyalty would never ever be in jeopardy to Jesus because they knew how much of a difference He had made in their lives. Add to that the countless others who had experienced amazing miracles that could only be accredited to Jesus being the Son of God. Many of them would still love this man. But the circumstances would change. In just a few days, the governing authorities would seek to stir up trouble. They would spread lies, and then, having Jesus arrested, they would stir up the crowd. Many of the fickle people who were just caught up in the excitement of Palm Sunday, shouting Hosanna, would then shout, "Crucify Him." The truth is that everything would change in those next few days. Even for Jesus' most devout followers, things would change. I picture, actually, as we look at the Scriptures, we see Jesus taken away and His disciples not knowing what to do. Really, the next time we see Peter and the other disciples doing anything, They're out fishing. What I find so interesting there is they knew all that Jesus had said, knew all that he had done. What was going through their mind now? Was it simply a statement of, well, if he's not here anymore, let's just go back to the way things used to be? But Jesus comes to him on the shore. And he says to him, Peter, it's not over. He actually asks him 3 times, do you love me? And each time when Jesus says yes, when Peter says yes, Jesus responds with instruction to feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. Understand that those are all action statements. He is instructing him that even though it's not the same way it has been, the fact is there's still work to be done. So be about doing the work that God's called you to do. You know, on the day of Pentecost, there would be Peter who would then stand up and proclaim the good news of Christ. So apparently he took notice of what was said to him. But it really wasn't the same anymore, was it? Because Jesus wasn't physically there with him. But it did not change the fact that God still had a work to be done. And how does this relate to us? First, let me say that in no way do I consider myself to be Christ. But over the past 10 plus years, I have led this church with great joy. I had someone point out this week that by this point in the ministry, every one of you is in some way connected to me. Either you came to this church since I've been here, or you've grown during the time that I've been here. You have been baptized. I've buried family members. I've done weddings for individuals. In some way, every one of you is in some way connected to me. However, change is upon us. This past Tuesday night at our local board meeting, I submitted my resignation to Chi United. Now, we'll likely still be here until the middle of July. But God has opened up an opportunity for me and my family that I believe we need to follow. As much as I love each of you, it would be selfish of me to stay here if I truly believe that God is leading me elsewhere. But I want to challenge and encourage you today to know that the best days of the church lie ahead. Certainly this has been an enjoyable journey for me, and change is never easy. But I believe that this church will continue to move forward and to grow. This coming week, the local board will begin this process of filling my position, and with the help of our district superintendent and the leadership of the Holy Spirit, God will provide the right person for this position, and I truly believe that. I share with you today probably the hardest message that I could share, and it's because I love you. It's not what I want to be able to share, but it's what I do believe I have to share. Thank you for allowing me to be your pastor for these past 10 years, and I believe that God will continue to bless you moving forward. I'm going to ask if you would to bow your heads and close your eyes, and then after we pray, I'm going to have Pat come up in just a moment. Father, thank you for what happened Palm Sunday. We know it's not the actual act of sacrifice. We'll celebrate that next week. It's not the act of resurrection. We'll celebrate that next week as well. But this was something that had to take place in order to prepare for something bigger. Lord, I thank you that you willingly went to Jerusalem, knowing what was going to take place when you got there. Lord, what a great image to know that you had us on your mind as you offered yourself. Remind us of that continually. But our greatest desire is to lift up your name. We know that things don't always go the way we want. But it doesn't change the fact that you are still in control. You are the one who is ordering our steps. But I pray today that you would bless this church.